The coffee was still warm in Kevin Bennett's hands when he realized his entire world had just shifted on its axis. Across from him at the small corner table, Peter Nelson sat with his own cup, steam rising between them like the unspoken words that had been building for months. Peter's eyes held that same gentle intensity that had been haunting Kevin's dreams. But now there was something else there, something that made Kevin's heart race and his breath catch in his throat. "I've been thinking about you all morning," Peter had just said, and the simple admission hung in the air like a promise neither of them had been brave enough to make until this moment. Kevin could feel the electricity crackling between them, could see the way Peter's fingers trembled slightly around his cup, could hear the vulnerability in his voice that matched the ache that had been living in Kevin's chest for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how a simple coffee run had become the catalyst for everything Kevin had been hoping for and terrifying himself over, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Kevin had been living what most people would consider a perfectly ordinary life. He worked at a marketing firm downtown, occupying a corner cubicle with a view of the building across the street and a coffee-stained desk that held the accumulated debris of 5 years of steady employment. He had a decent apartment in a neighborhood he could afford, a one-bedroom place with thin walls and a radiator that clanged through the winter nights, and maintained a careful routine that kept him safe from the kind of emotional chaos that had defined his early 20s. He'd learned to be content with safe, to find peace in predictable, to build walls high enough that disappointment couldn't reach him anymore. That was before Peter Nelson walked into his life like a hurricane disguised as a gentle spring rain. Peter had been hired as the new creative director, and from the moment he'd introduced himself to the team with a self-deprecating joke about his terrible sense of direction and an infectious laugh that seemed to light up the entire conference room, Kevin had felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just that Peter was attractive, though he undeniably was, with his dark hair that always looked slightly mussed as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without saying a word. It was something deeper, something that made Kevin feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Peter had a presence that filled whatever space he occupied without overwhelming it. He moved with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, asking thoughtful questions during presentations and offering insights that revealed both intelligence and genuine curiosity about the people around him. When he laughed, which was often, it was the kind of sound that made everyone else want to join in, warm and genuine and completely without artifice. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Peter had a way of moving through the world that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, confident without being arrogant, kind without being naive. He laughed easily and often, asked thoughtful questions during meetings that made everyone feel heard and valued, and had the rare gift of making everyone around him feel like they mattered. Kevin found himself looking forward to work in a way he never had before, found himself staying late just for the chance of a few extra minutes of conversation, found himself lying awake at night, replaying every interaction they had had that day. During those first weeks, Kevin learned that Peter had moved to the city from Portland, that he had strong opinions about coffee and stronger ones about the Oxford comma, that he'd studied literature in college before falling into marketing almost by accident. He discovered that Peter read voraciously, favoring literary fiction and philosophy, but harboring a secret love for trashy science fiction novels that he consumed with guilty pleasure. He learned that Peter was vegetarian, not for health reasons, but because he'd grown up on a farm and couldn't bring himself to eat anything he'd once helped raise. It started innocuously enough. Peter would stop by Kevin's desk to discuss a project, and their conversations would drift from work to books to movies to the kind of philosophical discussions that Kevin had always craved but rarely found. Peter was well-read and curious, with opinions that challenged Kevin's thinking and a laugh that made Kevin's stomach flip in the most delicious way. He had a habit of leaning against the edge of Kevin's desk when they talked, close enough that Kevin could catch hints of his cologne, something clean and understated that made Kevin want to lean closer. The first time Peter suggested they grab coffee after work, Kevin had almost said no. Self-preservation had been his default setting for so long that the impulse to retreat was automatic. The rational part of his brain was already cataloging all the reasons why spending time with Peter outside of work was a terrible idea. Peter was straight, Peter was his colleague, Peter was probably just being friendly, and Kevin was setting himself up for the kind of heartbreak he'd spent years learning to avoid. But something in Peter's expression, a hopefulness that mirrored Kevin's own hidden desires, made him say yes instead. "There's this place around the corner," Peter had said, his smile brightening in a way that made Kevin's chest tighten with dangerous possibility. "They have the kind of coffee that actually tastes like coffee instead of burnt water. What do you say?" That first coffee had stretched into 3 hours. They'd talked about everything and nothing, shared stories about their childhoods and their college years, debated the merits of various authors with the kind of passionate intensity that Kevin had always associated with the best kinds of friendships. Peter told him about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about parents who were supportive but didn't quite understand his creative ambitions, about the restlessness that had driven him to keep moving until he'd found himself in a city that felt like home. Kevin had shared his own stories more cautiously, still uncertain about how much of himself to reveal. But Peter listened with such genuine interest, asked such thoughtful follow-up questions, that Kevin found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He talked about his love of literature, his secret dream of writing a novel someday, his complicated relationship with his hometown, and the relief he'd felt when he'd finally escaped to somewhere he could be anonymous. They'd discovered a shared love of obscure indie films, particularly the kind of thoughtful character studies that most people found boring, but that Kevin had always treasured for their quiet intensity. Peter's eyes had lit up when Kevin mentioned his favorite director, and they'd spent 20 minutes discussing the subtle brilliance of a film that Kevin had never found anyone else who'd even heard of, much less appreciated. Kevin had gone home that night feeling more alive than he had in months, but also more terrified. Because somewhere between Peter's second cup of coffee and his easy laughter at Kevin's terrible joke about marketing campaigns, Kevin had realized he was falling hard. The weeks that followed established a pattern that became both Kevin's salvation and his torment. Coffee after work became a regular occurrence, sometimes planned, sometimes spontaneous. Peter would appear at Kevin's desk with that particular smile that made Kevin's heart skip, would tilt his head in that way that suggested he was about to propose something wonderful, and ask, "Ready for that caffeine fix?" And Kevin, despite every rational thought telling him to protect himself, would always say yes. Their conversations during these coffee dates ranged from the philosophical to the mundane, but Kevin treasured them all equally. Peter had opinions about everything, from the best way to brew coffee, to the decline of independent bookstores, to the way certain songs could transport you instantly to specific moments in your past. He was passionate without being pretentious, thoughtful without being overly serious. And he had a way of making Kevin feel like his own thoughts and opinions mattered in a way they never had before. Peter talked about his life with an openness that Kevin envied and feared in equal measure. He'd moved to the city after ending a long-term relationship with a woman named Sarah, someone he described with fondness, but without the kind of passion that Kevin had always imagined love should contain. "She was wonderful," Peter would say, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate precision, his expression thoughtful and slightly sad. "Smart and kind and everything anyone would want in a partner. But something was always missing. I could never put my finger on what it was." Kevin would listen to these confessions with his heart breaking and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Part of him wanted to offer comfort, to be the friend Peter clearly needed as he navigated this period of his life. But another part, the part Kevin tried desperately to ignore, wanted to be the answer to whatever Peter was searching for. He wanted to be the missing piece, the thing that would make Peter's eyes light up the way they did when he talked about books or movies or ideas that excited him. The torture was exquisite and constant. Peter was tactile in a way that made Kevin's skin burn with awareness. He would touch Kevin's shoulder when making a point, his hand warm and solid through the fabric of Kevin's shirt. He would brush their fingers together when passing documents, the contact brief but electric. He would lean close enough during presentations that Kevin could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could count the gold flecks in his brown eyes and notice the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. Kevin told himself these touches meant nothing, that Peter was simply someone who communicated through physical contact, but his body responded regardless of what his mind tried to rationalize. Every casual touch sent electricity shooting through his nervous system. Every shared laugh felt like a small victory. Every moment of eye contact stretched just a beat too long felt like a promise Kevin was afraid to believe in. There were moments when Kevin caught Peter looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Something soft and wondering would cross Peter's features, usually when Kevin was explaining something he was passionate about, or when he laughed at one of Peter's stories. These moments would stretch just a beat longer than normal conversation required, and Kevin would feel his breath catch, would feel hope and terror warring in his chest, before Peter would blink and the moment would pass like it had never happened at all. Kevin began to catalog these interactions like a scholar studying ancient texts, searching for hidden meanings in every gesture, every word, every pause. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he was reading significance into innocent moments, because he wanted so desperately for there to be significance. But late at night, when the rational voice in his head finally quieted, he would replay these scenes and allow himself to wonder, what if, during one particularly memorable coffee conversation, Peter had been telling him about a book he'd just finished, his hands moving expressively as he described the author's use of metaphor. It's like she took all these ordinary moments, he'd said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm, and showed you how they were actually profound, how the simple act of making coffee in the morning could be about hope and routine in the way we create meaning in our lives. Kevin had found himself leaning forward, drawn in by Peter's passion in the way his whole face transformed when he talked about something that moved him. "That sounds beautiful," Kevin had said, and something in his voice must have conveyed more than he'd intended, because Peter had paused mid-gesture and looked at him with such intensity that Kevin felt his cheeks flush. "You should read it," Peter had said softly, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the book anymore. "I think you'd understand it in a way that most people wouldn't." The moment had stretched between them, charged with possibility, before Peter had seemed to catch himself and return to his normal, friendly demeanor. But Kevin had carried that look, that tone, with him for days afterward, turning it over in his mind like a precious stone he was afraid to examine too closely. The shift began on a Thursday evening in October. They were at their usual coffee shop, a small place called The Daily Grind, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local artwork, when Peter received a call from Sarah. Kevin watched Peter's face change as he listened, watched the easy contentment that had been there moments before transform into something more complicated. "I'm sorry," Peter had said after ending the call, his expression troubled. "That was Sarah. She wants to meet for dinner tomorrow night." Kevin's coffee suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. "Oh, is everything okay?" Peter had run his hand through his hair, a gesture Kevin had learned to associate with stress or uncertainty. "She wants to try again," he'd said, his voice carrying a confusion that Kevin felt echo in his own chest. "She thinks we gave up too easily, that we should fight for what we had." Kevin managed to ask the appropriate questions about what Peter was thinking, what he wanted to do, but inside, he felt something essential cracking. All the careful hope he'd been building, all the moments he'd treasured and analyzed and held close to his heart, suddenly felt foolish and naive. Of course Peter would go back to Sarah. Of course Kevin had been reading too much into innocent gestures and friendly conversations. Of course he'd been setting himself up for exactly the kind of heartbreak he'd spent years learning to avoid. Peter talked through his confusion with the kind of trust that made Kevin simultaneously honored and heartbroken. He spoke about the comfort of familiarity, about the pressure from friends and family who had loved him and Sarah together, about the fear that maybe he was being too picky, too idealistic in his expectations of love. "But when I think about going back," Peter had said, staring into his cup as if it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate, "it feels like putting on clothes that don't quite fit anymore. Like I've grown into someone different and I'm trying to squeeze back into who I used to be." Kevin had wanted to tell him that growth was good, that becoming someone new meant leaving behind things that no longer served you, that settling for comfort when you crave something deeper was a betrayal of the person you were becoming. But he couldn't say any of these things without revealing too much of his own heart. So he offered the kind of neutral support that friends give each other, even as every word felt like a small death. Maybe the fact that it doesn't feel right is your answer, Kevin had said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. Maybe you've outgrown what you had, and that's not a failure. That's just life. Peter had looked at him with such gratitude that Kevin felt his heart break a little more. You always know exactly what to say, Peter had said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you, Kevin. And Kevin had smiled and said something appropriate about friendship and being there for each other, all while dying inside because being Peter's friend was both everything he wanted and nothing like enough. The following weeks were a special kind of hell for Kevin. Peter was clearly wrestling with his decision about Sarah, and Kevin found himself in the impossible position of being the confidant for the man he was in love with, as that man debated returning to someone else. Peter would seek him out during the day, would appear at Kevin's desk with an urgency that suggested he needed Kevin's presence to think clearly, and Kevin couldn't bring himself to refuse, even though every conversation felt like torture. I had dinner with her last night, Peter would say, settling into the chair beside Kevin's desk with a troubled expression. She made all my favorite foods, talked about the trips we'd planned to take, reminded me of all the good times we had together. Kevin would listen and nod and offer what wisdom he could, even as his heart shattered a little more with each detail. He learned more about Peter's relationship with Sarah than he'd ever wanted to know, learned about their shared history and inside jokes and the comfortable domesticity they'd built together over 3 years. But there were contradictions in Peter's stories that Kevin couldn't help but notice. For every fond memory Peter shared, there was an underlying sense of something missing, something that had never quite clicked into place. Peter talked about Sarah with affection and respect, but never with the kind of passion that made his eyes light up the way they did when he discussed books or ideas that truly moved him. During these conversations, Peter would talk about love and relationships with a philosophical bent that made Kevin's heart ache with recognition. What if the problem isn't that I'm too picky, Peter would say, his voice thoughtful and uncertain, but that I've been looking for the wrong things entirely? What if real connection looks different than what I've been taught to expect? Kevin would listen and offer what wisdom he could, even as every word felt like he was helping Peter build a case for staying with someone else. But there were moments, brief and shining, when Peter would look at him with such intensity that Kevin wondered if maybe, possibly, Peter was working through more than just his relationship with Sarah. Sometimes I think I've been trying so hard to make something work that I've missed what was right in front of me, Peter had said one afternoon, his eyes fixed on Kevin's face with an expression that made Kevin's breath catch. Like I've been looking for something exotic and complicated when what I really needed was simple and true. Kevin had felt his heart stop, had felt hope and terror warring in his chest as he tried to interpret the meaning behind Peter's words. But before he could respond, before he could even process what was happening, Peter had seemed to catch himself and had quickly changed the subject to something safer, something that didn't make Kevin feel like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. The uncertainty was killing Kevin slowly. He found himself analyzing every conversation, every gesture, every look for hidden meaning. He would lie awake at night replaying Peter's words, trying to decide if he was imagining the undercurrent of something deeper, or if Peter was actually trying to tell him something he was afraid to say directly. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when Peter arrived at Kevin's apartment unannounced. Kevin had given him his address weeks earlier, during a conversation about their respective neighborhoods and the best places to find decent takeout, but Peter had never used it before. When Kevin opened the door, he found Peter standing in the hallway looking lost and raw in a way that made Kevin's chest tighten with concern. I called it off, Peter said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah and I told her I couldn't go back. Kevin invited him in, his hands shaking slightly as he made tea because his hands needed something to do, and because he was afraid of what his face might reveal if he didn't keep busy. He listened as Peter explained his decision, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and uncertainty that Kevin recognized from his own experience with difficult choices. Peter talked about realizing that he'd been trying to force himself back into a life that no longer felt authentic, about understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone you cared about was to stop pretending you could be what they needed. She deserves someone who loves her completely, Peter said, accepting the mug of tea Kevin offered with hands that trembled slightly. Someone who doesn't have to work to feel what should come naturally. But as Peter talked, Kevin noticed something different in his demeanor. There was relief in his voice, yes, but also something that looked like anticipation. Peter kept looking at Kevin with an expression that seemed to be building towards something, as if he was gathering courage for a conversation that went beyond his breakup with Sarah. Kevin, Peter said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Kevin's pulse quicken. Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Kevin nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Have you ever felt like you were living your life in black and white, and then suddenly someone walks in and everything is in color? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Kevin felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the careful composure he'd maintained for months beginning to slip. Because yes, he knew exactly what Peter meant. Yes, he had felt exactly that way, and it had started the moment Peter had walked into his life. I think so, Kevin managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter moved closer on the couch, close enough that Kevin could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about color and black and white, and what it means when someone changes everything just by existing in your world. Kevin's mouth went dry. He could feel the electricity crackling between them, could see something vulnerable and hopeful in Peter's expression that made his own heart race with terrifying possibility. Kevin, Peter said, and his name sounded different in Peter's voice, softer and more intimate than it ever had before. I think I need to tell you something. I think I need to be honest about what's been happening in my head, in my heart these past few months. But before Peter could continue, before Kevin could process what was happening or prepare himself for whatever Peter was about to say, Peter's phone rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass, and Kevin watched as Peter reluctantly answered, watched as the vulnerable expression on his face transformed back into something more guarded. It was work, some crisis that required Peter's immediate attention, and Kevin watched helplessly as the moment slipped away from them. Peter left with promises to continue their conversation later, pressing a brief, warm hand to Kevin's shoulder before disappearing into the night. But later never came. The weekend passed in a blur of unanswered texts and growing anxiety, and by Monday morning, Kevin had convinced himself that he'd imagined the entire thing. Monday brought a return to their normal routine, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. Peter was still warm, still sought out Kevin's company, but there was a carefulness in his behavior that hadn't been there before. Kevin found himself analyzing every interaction, searching for signs of what had almost happened on Friday night. But Peter seemed determined to maintain a safe distance from whatever precipice they'd approached. The careful dance they performed over the following days was exhausting. Kevin would catch Peter looking at him with that same intense expression, would feel the familiar electricity when their hands accidentally brushed during document exchanges, would sense Peter building up to something significant, only to watch him retreat at the last moment. It was like watching someone approach the edge of a cliff repeatedly, gathering courage to jump, only to step back each time. Are you okay? Kevin finally asked one afternoon when Peter had stopped by his desk, opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. I'm fine, Peter had replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Just work stuff, you know? Kevin didn't know, but he nodded anyway because pushing felt dangerous and he was afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing existed between them. Kevin began to wonder if he was losing his mind. The rational part of his brain insisted that he was projecting his own desires onto innocent interactions, that Peter's confusion about Sarah had nothing to do with him, that the moments of intensity he thought he was witnessing were simply the product of his overactive imagination and desperate hope. But his heart, his treacherous heart, insisted otherwise. The torture reached its peak on a Wednesday afternoon when Peter appeared at Kevin's desk with an expression that Kevin had learned to associate with their coffee conversations. But instead of his usual invitation, Peter hesitated, opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Never mind, Peter said, shaking his head with a self-deprecating smile that didn't hide the frustration in his eyes. I should let you get back to work. Kevin watched him walk away and felt something snap inside his chest. The careful patience he'd been maintaining, the willingness to wait for Peter to work through whatever he was processing, suddenly felt unsustainable. He was tired of existing in limbo, tired of analyzing every gesture for hidden meaning, tired of feeling like he was slowly disappearing into the space between hope and despair. That evening, Kevin made a decision. He was going to create some distance, was going to protect himself from the emotional whiplash of Peter's uncertainty. He would be professional and friendly at work, but he would stop making himself available for the coffee conversations that were slowly destroying his equilibrium. It was self-preservation, pure and simple, and it was long overdue. He practiced what he would say if Peter asked him to coffee, rehearsed polite excuses that would maintain their professional relationship while protecting his heart. He would be busy. He would have other plans. He would gradually extract himself from the intimate friendship that was killing him by degrees. The plan lasted exactly 18 hours. Thursday morning brought Peter to Kevin's desk with an expression of barely contained panic. Kevin, he said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Kevin's resolution crumble instantly. I need to talk to you, please. Can we grab coffee after work? Kevin looked into Peter's eyes and saw something desperate there. Something that suggested Peter was fighting his own internal battle and losing. Despite every rational thought telling him to maintain his boundaries, despite every self-preservation instinct screaming at him to protect himself, Kevin found himself nodding. Of course, he heard himself say. Same place as always? Peter's relief was palpable. Thank you, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was thanking Kevin for more than just agreeing to coffee. The coffee shop was unusually crowded that evening, forcing them to sit closer together than normal at a small table in the corner. Peter seemed agitated in a way Kevin had never seen before, his usual easy confidence replaced by something more fragmented and raw. He kept running his hands through his hair, kept starting sentences only to abandon them halfway through, kept looking at Kevin like he was trying to memorize his face. I've been thinking about Friday night, Peter said without preamble, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup like it was an anchor. About what I was trying to tell you before my phone rang. Kevin's heart began to race, but he forced himself to remain calm. What about it? Peter was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held the words he was struggling to find. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a vulnerability that made Kevin's breath catch. I think I've been lying to myself, Peter said slowly, each word carefully chosen and weighted with significance. About Sarah, about what I want, about what's been missing from my life. I think I've been so focused on trying to fit into the life I thought I was supposed to want that I missed what was right in front of me. Kevin felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. The noise of the coffee shop faded into background static, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat and the careful cadence of Peter's words. Kevin, Peter continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I think the reason nothing ever felt right with Sarah, the reason I always felt like something was missing, is because I was comparing everything to what I have with you. The words hung between them like a confession and a question and a prayer all at once. Kevin felt his carefully constructed walls crumble completely, felt years of self-protection dissolve in the face of Peter's raw honesty. But along with the overwhelming relief came a terror so complete it nearly took his breath away. What are you saying? Kevin managed, his voice barely audible over the thundering of his heart. Peter reached across the table, his fingers finding Kevin's with a deliberation that suggested he'd been thinking about this moment for longer than Kevin had dared to hope. I'm saying that every relationship I've ever had has felt like I was playing a role, like I was trying to be someone I'm not. But with you, Kevin, with you, I feel like myself, more than myself. I feel like the person I was meant to be. Kevin stared down at their joined hands, at the way Peter's fingers fit perfectly between his own, at the rightness of the connection that he'd been dreaming about for months. The rational part of his brain was screaming warnings about workplace relationships and the complications of dating someone who had just ended a long-term relationship with a woman, but his heart was singing with a joy so pure it drowned out every other consideration. "Peter," Kevin said, his voice shaking with the weight of everything he'd been holding back. "I've been in love with you since the day you started working with us. I've been pretending to be your friend while dying a little bit every day because I wanted so much more and thought I could never have it." Peter's eyes widened, and Kevin saw his own wonder reflected there. "You have?" he breathed. "This whole time?" "This whole time," Kevin confirmed, his voice growing stronger as he finally allowed himself to speak the truth he'd been carrying for months. "Every coffee conversation, every late night at the office, every moment you talked about Sarah and what was missing from your relationship. I was falling deeper in love with you and hating myself for it." Peter's grip on Kevin's hand tightened, and Kevin could see tears gathering in his eyes. "I thought I was going crazy," Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was imagining the way you looked at me sometimes, the way the air seemed to change when we were together. I thought I was projecting my own confusion onto innocent moments." Kevin laughed, a sound that was half relief and half hysteria. "We've both been losing our minds, haven't we?" Peter smiled then, the first genuine, unguarded smile Kevin had seen from him in weeks. "Completely," he agreed. "But maybe that's what love is supposed to feel like. Maybe it's supposed to turn your world upside down and make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself." Kevin felt something settle into place in his chest, something that had been displaced and searching for so long, he'd forgotten what wholeness felt like. "Is that what this is?" he asked, needing to hear the words spoken aloud, needing to make this moment real and undeniable. Peter lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Kevin's knuckles that sent electricity shooting through every nerve in Kevin's body. "I love you," Peter said simply, and the words were everything Kevin had been hoping to hear and everything he'd been terrified he never would. "I love you too," Kevin replied, and saying it aloud felt like stepping into sunlight after years of living in shadow. They sat in the crowded coffee shop, hands linked across the small table, grinning at each other like teenagers who had just discovered something miraculous. Kevin felt giddy with relief and possibility, felt like he could float right out of his chair and drift toward the ceiling with the sheer joy of finally being able to love Peter openly. But even as his heart soared, Kevin's mind was already racing ahead to the complications they would face. Peter had just ended a long-term relationship. They worked together. Peter had never been with a man before, as far as Kevin knew. There would be questions and adjustments and moments of doubt. Peter seemed to sense the direction of Kevin's thoughts. "I know this is complicated," he said softly, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across Kevin's knuckles. "I know there are things we need to figure out, conversations we need to have. But Kevin, I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this, of us." Kevin squeezed Peter's hand, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his touch. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest. "Whatever comes, we'll figure it out together." Peter's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face and making Kevin's heart skip in the most wonderful way. "Together," he repeated, like he was testing the word, savoring the way it felt in his mouth. "I like the sound of that." They talked for another hour, their hands never separating, working through the immediate practicalities of what this meant for them. They would take things slowly, they decided. They would be discreet at work until they figured out how to navigate the professional implications. They would give Peter time to process this new understanding of himself without pressure or expectations. But underneath all the careful planning, Kevin could feel something electric and inevitable building between them. The way Peter looked at him had changed, become more open and hungry and full of possibility. The way Peter's thumb continued to trace patterns on his skin sent shivers of anticipation through Kevin's entire body. They left the coffee shop that evening with a plan to take things slowly, to navigate the transition from friendship to something deeper with the care and consideration it deserved. But as they walked toward the subway station, Peter suddenly stopped, turning to face Kevin with an expression of such intensity that Kevin's breath caught in his throat. "Kevin," Peter said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Kevin nodded, though his heart was racing with sudden anxiety. What is it? Peter stepped closer, close enough that Kevin could see the gold flecks in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I know we said we'd take things slowly, but I've been thinking about kissing you for weeks now, and I don't think I can wait another minute. Kevin felt his knees go weak with relief and desire and pure, overwhelming love. Yes, he breathed, please. Yes, Peter's hands came up to frame Kevin's face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with a tenderness that made Kevin's heart ache in the most beautiful way. And then Peter was kissing him, soft and sweet and careful at first, as if he was afraid Kevin might disappear if he moved too quickly. But Kevin had been dreaming of this moment for months, and he kissed Peter back with all the love and longing and desperate hope he'd been carrying in his heart. Peter made a soft sound of surprise and pleasure, and the kiss deepened, became more urgent, more real, more everything Kevin had imagined, and so much better than anything his fantasies had prepared him for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Peters rested his forehead against Kevin's and smiled with such joy that Kevin felt his heart might actually burst from happiness. Wow, Peter breathed, his voice full of wonder. That was perfect, Kevin finished, and Peter's smile widened. Better than perfect, Peter corrected. That was like coming home. Kevin felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the rightness of the moment, by the incredible gift of being loved by this man he thought was forever out of reach. I love you, he said again, because he could say it now, because it was true and real and reciprocated. I love you too, Peter replied, pressing another soft kiss to Kevin's lips. So much, Kevin, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. They stood there on the busy sidewalk, wrapped in each other's arms, oblivious to the crowds of people flowing around them. Kevin had never felt more exposed and more protected at the same time, had never experienced such a perfect combination of vulnerability and safety. I can't believe this is real, Peter murmured against Kevin's lips, his breath warm and sweet. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out I dreamed the whole thing. Kevin pulled back just enough to look into Peter's eyes, to see the wonder and disbelief and pure joy reflected there. It's real, he said firmly. We're real. This is happening. Peter's smile was brighter than the streetlights beginning to flicker on around them. This is happening, he repeated, like he was trying to make himself believe it. Eventually, the practical realities of standing on a public street began to intrude, and they reluctantly separated, though Peter kept Kevin's hand firmly clasped in his own as they made their way to the subway station. The train ride to Kevin's apartment, while Sharma's, was a blur of stolen glances and gentle touches, of Peter's thumb tracing patterns on the back of Kevin's hand in whispered conversations about everything and nothing. Kevin felt like he was floating, like he existed in some magical space between dream and reality, where impossible things were suddenly, miraculously possible. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Peter said quietly as the train swayed through the tunnel. For someone to tell me this is all a mistake, that I don't know what I'm doing. Kevin squeezed his hand. Do you feel like you're making a mistake? Peter was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that Kevin had always loved about him. No, he said finally. That's the thing that surprises me most. I thought I'd be terrified, thought I'd be second-guessing everything. But this feels right in a way that nothing else ever has. When they reached Kevin's building, Peter hesitated at the entrance. I should probably go home, he said, though his voice carried no conviction. We said we'd take things slowly. Kevin looked into Peter's eyes and saw his own desire reflected there, but also uncertainty and the kind of careful consideration that had drawn Kevin to him in the first place. You should do whatever feels right to you, Kevin said gently. No pressure, no expectations, just whatever you need. Peter was quiet for a moment, studying Kevin's face as if memorizing every detail. What I need, he said finally, his voice soft but certain, is to not be apart from you tonight. What I need is to fall asleep knowing this is real, that I didn't imagine everything that just happened. Kevin's heart swelled with tenderness and relief. Then come upstairs, he said simply. We don't have to do anything except be together. Kevin's apartment had never felt more like home than it did that night, with Peter curled against his side on the couch, both of them still fully clothed, but closer than they had ever been before. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, sharing stories and fears and dreams with a kind of openness that felt both terrifying and essential. Peter talked about his confusion over the past few months, about the growing realization that what he'd been searching for had been right in front of him all along. He described the moment he'd understood that every relationship he'd ever had been measured against the connection he felt with Kevin, and how that realization had both thrilled and terrified him. I kept thinking about the way you laugh, Peter said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Kevin's arm. The way your whole face changes when you're really enjoying something. I'd find myself trying to make you laugh just to see that expression. And then I'd wonder why making you happy felt more important than anything else in my life. Kevin shared his own journey of falling in love with someone he'd thought was straight, of the agony of listening to Peter talk about Sarah while desperately wanting to be the one Peter came home to every night. He talked about the careful walls he'd built to protect himself and how Peter had dismantled them without even trying. I used to lie awake at night replaying our conversations, Kevin admitted, his voice soft in the dim light of his living room. I'd analyze every word, every gesture, looking for signs that maybe you felt something too. I felt like I was going crazy. Peter lifted his head from Kevin's shoulder to look at him, his expression tender and slightly guilty. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry I put you through that. I was so confused about what I was feeling, so scared of what it might mean. Kevin cupped Peter's face in his hand, thumb brushing across his cheekbone. You don't have to apologize for being human, he said gently, for taking time to figure yourself out. I'm just grateful we found our way here eventually. As the night wore on, they found themselves gravitating closer together, drawn by a magnetic pull that felt as natural as breathing. Peter's head found its way to Kevin's shoulder, Kevin's fingers found their way into Peter's hair, and they settled into a contentment that felt like the missing piece Kevin had been searching for his entire life. I can't believe this is real, Peter murmured against Kevin's neck, his breath warm against Kevin's skin. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out I dreamed the whole thing. Kevin pressed a kiss to the top of Peter's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo that he'd been cataloging for months without admitting it to himself. It's real, he said softly. We're real. They fell asleep that way, tangled together on Kevin's couch like they'd been doing it for years instead of hours. Kevin woke up first as dawn light filtered through his windows, and for a moment he lay perfectly still, afraid to move and break the spell. But Peter was solid and warm against him, breathing deeply in sleep, and Kevin allowed himself to believe that this miraculous thing had actually happened. Peter stirred as Kevin shifted slightly, blinking awake with the kind of confused disorientation that comes from sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. But when his eyes focused on Kevin's face, his expression transformed into something so soft and happy that Kevin felt his heart skip. Good morning, Peter said, his voice rough with sleep and absolutely beautiful to Kevin's ears. Good morning, Kevin replied, unable to keep the smile off his face. How did you sleep? Peter stretched slightly, then settled back against Kevin's chest with a contented sigh. Better than I have in months, he admitted. I forgot what it felt like to wake up somewhere I actually wanted to be. Kevin felt a surge of possessive tenderness that surprised him with its intensity. He wanted to be the place Peter woke up every morning, wanted to win the last thing Peter saw every night, wanted to build a life with this man who had turned his world upside down in the most beautiful way possible. But they had time for all of that. They had time to figure out the logistics of workplace relationships and coming out and all the practical considerations that would need to be addressed. Right now, they had this moment, this perfect bubble of contentment and possibility, and Kevin was determined to savor every second of it. Peter seemed to share his sentiment, making no move to untangle himself from Kevin's arms. Instead, he tilted his head up to press a soft kiss to Kevin's jaw, a gesture so natural and intimate that Kevin's breath caught. I love you, Peter said quietly, like he was testing out the words, seeing how they felt in his mouth. I love you, Kevin Bennett, and I want to figure out how to build a life with you. Kevin felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of hearing his name spoken with such tenderness. I love you too, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. And we will figure it out. all of it. They lay there in the growing morning light, talking softly about practical things like coffee and breakfast, and what time Peter needed to be home to change clothes for work. But underneath the mundane conversation was a current of electricity, an awareness of each other that made even the simplest interaction feel charged with possibility. "We should probably get up," Peter said eventually, though he made no move to actually do so. "Probably," Kevin agreed, equally reluctant to end this perfect moment. They stayed curled together for another 20 minutes, neither wanting to be the first to break the spell. When they finally did get up, it was with reluctance and the promise that this was just the beginning, that there would be many more mornings like this one. The following weeks were a blur of stolen moments and careful navigation as they figured out how to transition from friends to lovers while maintaining their professional relationship. They were discreet at work, but Kevin found himself catching Peter's eye across conference rooms and sharing secret smiles that felt like the most precious kind of conspiracy. At first, they were almost comically careful about maintaining their professional boundaries. Peter would stop by Kevin's desk to discuss projects with the same frequency as before, but now their conversations carried an undercurrent of electricity that made Kevin's skin tingle with awareness. They would exchange documents with deliberate care to avoid their fingers brushing, both of them hyper-aware of the potential for even innocent contact to give them away. But their colleagues seemed oblivious to the shift in their dynamic. If anything, people commented on how well they worked together, how their collaborative energy seemed to elevate everyone around them. Kevin began to wonder if their connection had been obvious to everyone except themselves. Their evenings belonged entirely to each other. Peter had officially moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Sarah, and while he looked for a new place, he spent most nights at Kevin's. They fell into a routine that felt both new and ancient, cooking dinner together, sharing books and movies, talking until late into the night about everything and nothing. Kevin discovered that Peter was an excellent cook, with a repertoire of vegetarian dishes that transformed Kevin's simple kitchen into something that felt like a real home. Peter would move around the space with easy confidence, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces while keeping up a steady stream of conversation about his day, his thoughts, his dreams for their future together. "I never understood the appeal of cooking for someone else before," Peter said one evening as he watched Kevin taste the pasta sauce he had been perfecting. "But seeing you enjoy something I made feels like the most satisfying thing in the world." Kevin had pulled him close then, tasting the sauce on Peter's lips and marveling at the domestic bliss of it all. "Everything tastes better when it's made with love," he'd said, and Peter's smile had been radiant. The physical aspect of their relationship developed slowly, with a tenderness and consideration that made Kevin fall even deeper in love with Peter every day. Peter approached each new level of intimacy with a wonder that suggested he was discovering parts of himself he'd never known existed. And Kevin felt honored to be trusted with such precious revelations. Their first real kiss in the privacy of Kevin's apartment had been a revelation for both of them. They'd been sitting on the couch talking about a movie they'd just watched when Peter had suddenly gone quiet, his eyes fixed on Kevin's mouth with an intensity that made Kevin's breath catch. "Can I kiss you properly this time?" Peter had asked, his voice soft but certain. "Without worrying about who might see us?" Kevin's answer had been to lean forward and capture Peter's lips with his own, pouring months of longing and love into the connection. Peter had responded with a hunger that surprised them both, his hands tangling in Kevin's hair as they lost themselves in each other. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Peter had rested his forehead against Kevin's and laughed softly. "I had no idea," he'd said, his voice full of wonder. "I had no idea it could feel like this." There were moments of uncertainty, times when Peter would grow quiet and thoughtful in a way that made Kevin's chest tighten with anxiety. During these moments, Kevin would resist the urge to push, instead offering the same patient presence that had characterized their friendship. And Peter, seeming to sense Kevin's understanding, would eventually share whatever was troubling him. "I keep waiting for this to feel wrong," Peter confessed one evening as they lay in bed together, Kevin's fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "I keep waiting for some internal alarm to go off, telling me I'm making a mistake, but it never comes. This feels more right than anything I've ever done." Kevin pressed a kiss to Peter's shoulder, tasting the salt of his skin and marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now, allowed to love Peter openly and completely. "Maybe that's your answer," he said softly. "Maybe the fact that it feels right is all the confirmation you need." Peter turned in Kevin's arms, studying his face with an intensity that made Kevin's heart race. "How did you know?" he asked. "About yourself, I mean. How did you know you were gay?" Kevin considered the question, thinking back to his own journey of self-discovery. "I think I always knew on some level," he said finally. "But it took me a long time to admit it to myself, longer to accept it, and even longer to believe I deserved to be happy. The world teaches us that love should look a certain way, and when your heart doesn't fit that mold, it can feel like you're broken instead of just different." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I spent so much time trying to be what I thought I was supposed to be that I never stopped to consider what I actually wanted. And then you came along and suddenly everything I thought I knew about myself got turned upside down." Kevin cupped Peter's face in his hands, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "You're not broken," he said firmly. "You're not confused or going through a phase or any of the other things people might say. You are just figuring out who you really are, and that's the bravest thing anyone can do." Peter's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned into Kevin's touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Kevin felt his own eyes well up with emotion. "I love you too," he replied, "and I promise you, we're going to figure this out together. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them as a team." Peter kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Kevin felt his heart settle into a contentment he'd never experienced before. This was what he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. This perfect combination of passion and tenderness, of friendship and romance, of safety and adventure. 3 months after that first kiss outside the coffee shop, Kevin found himself in the same cafe where everything had changed, waiting for Peter to arrive. But this time, instead of the anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized so many of their early meetings, Kevin felt nothing but anticipation and joy. The morning was crisp and bright, with the kind of October light that made everything look like it was touched with gold. Kevin had arrived early, claiming their usual table by the window and ordering coffee for both of them. He watched the street outside, noting the way the autumn leaves caught the sunlight, and thinking about how different his life had become since that first nervous coffee conversation months ago. Peter appeared in the doorway, scanning the room until his eyes found Kevin's, and his face lit up with the kind of smile that still made Kevin's heart skip after all this time. He made his way through the crowded cafe, stopping at the counter to exchange pleasantries with the barista who knew their orders by heart, and Kevin watched him with the kind of proprietary affection that still amazed him with its intensity. When Peter reached their table, he set down 2 cups and leaned down to press a quick kiss to Kevin's lips, a gesture so natural and easy, yet Kevin marveled at how far they'd come from those early days of careful distance and unspoken longing. "Good morning, beautiful," Peter said, settling into his chair with a contentment that radiated from every line of his body. "Good morning yourself," Kevin replied, reaching across the table to link their fingers together. "How was your meeting with the realtor?" Peter's smile widened, and Kevin felt his heart begin to race with anticipation. They'd been looking at apartments for weeks, searching for a place that would be theirs together, and Kevin could tell from Peter's expression that something significant had happened. "She found us the perfect place," Peter said, his voice full of excitement. "2 bedrooms, lots of natural light, a kitchen big enough for both of us to cook in without killing each other. And Kevin, it's only 6 blocks from here." Kevin felt a surge of joy so intense it nearly took his breath away. They'd been talking about moving in together officially for weeks, but hearing that it was actually happening, that they were going to have a place that belonged to both of them, felt like a dream coming true. "Tell me everything," Kevin said, leaning forward eagerly. "What's it like? What did you think when you saw it?" Peter's eyes lit up as he began to describe the apartment in detail. "The living room has these huge windows that face east, so we'll get morning light for our coffee. The kitchen has granite countertops and enough cabinet space for all your books and my cooking equipment. And Kevin, The bedroom has a walk-in closet and a view of this little garden courtyard that's so peaceful you forget you're in the middle of the city. Kevin could picture it all as Peter spoke, could see them making coffee in the morning sunlight, cooking dinner together in the spacious kitchen, falling asleep in each other's arms with the sound of the city muted by the peaceful courtyard. It sounded perfect, like a life he'd dreamed of but never dared to hope for. "When can we see it?" Kevin asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the excitement coursing through his veins. "This afternoon, if you want," Peter replied. "She's holding it for us until 5, but Kevin, I have to tell you, the moment I walked in, I could see us there. I could see us making coffee in the morning, reading on the couch in the evenings, building a life together in every room." Kevin felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of Peter's vision of their future. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, let's go see our home." Peter's smile was radiant, and he lifted Kevin's hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to his palm that sent warmth shooting through Kevin's entire body. "I love you," he said simply. And the words were everything Kevin had ever wanted to hear and everything he'd never dared to hope for. "I love you too," Kevin replied, and the truth of it filled every corner of his heart. They sat in the coffee shop where their love story had truly begun, hands linked across the table, talking about paint colors and furniture, and all the mundane, beautiful details of building a life together. Kevin felt a peace settle into his bones, a sense of rightness that he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. "I can't believe how much has changed," Peter said, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on Kevin's knuckles. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life was going to look like. I thought I had it all figured out." "And now?" Kevin asked, though he could see the answer in Peter's eyes. "Now I realize I didn't know anything," Peter said with a laugh. "I was living in black and white, trying to force myself into a life that looked right from the outside but felt empty on the inside. And then you came along and suddenly everything was in color." Kevin felt his heart swell with tenderness. "You came along and changed everything for me too," he said softly. "I'd given up on the idea that I could have this, could have someone who loved me the way you do." Peter squeezed his hand. "Well, you're stuck with me now," he said with a grin. "I'm not going anywhere." As they prepared to leave, Kevin caught Peter's eye and smiled. "Ready to go see our future?" he asked, and Peter's answering grin was brighter than the autumn sun streaming through the windows. "More than ready," Peter replied, standing and pulling Kevin into his arms for a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises and forever. The apartment was perfect, just as Peter had promised. 2 bedrooms with hardwood floors and windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light, a kitchen with enough counter space for both of them to cook without getting in each other's way, a living room that Kevin could already picture filled with books and plants and all the accumulated treasures of a shared life. But more than the physical space, Kevin loved the way Peter moved through the rooms, pointing out details and possibilities with an enthusiasm that spoke of genuine excitement about their future together. He could see Peter's vision taking shape as they walked through each room, could imagine the life they would build within these walls. "This could be your office," Peter said, standing in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "You could set up your computer by the window, have your books on shelves along this wall. It would be perfect for writing." Kevin felt his heart skip at the casual way Peter referenced his long-held dream of writing a novel, something he'd shared with Peter months ago, but had never expected him to remember, much less incorporate into their shared future. In the kitchen, Peter opened cabinets and drawers, already planning where everything would go. "We could put your coffee maker here," he said, "and I could keep my spice collection in this cabinet. Look, there's even a window over the sink so we can watch the garden while we do dishes." The master bedroom was spacious and bright, with a large window that overlooked a small garden courtyard. Kevin came up behind Peter as he stood looking out at the peaceful space, wrapping his arms around Peter's waist and resting his chin on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Kevin asked softly, breathing in the familiar scent of Peter's cologne. Peter leaned back against Kevin's chest, solid and warm and perfectly right in Kevin's arms. "I'm thinking about waking up here every morning with you," he said quietly. "I'm thinking about how different my life is now compared to 6 months ago. How much happier I am than I ever thought it was possible to be. Kevin pressed a kiss to the side of Peter's neck, tasting the salt of his skin and marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this, allowed to love Peter openly and completely. 6 months ago, I was convinced I was going to spend my life watching you from a distance, he admitted. I never imagined I could have this, could have you. Peter turned in Kevin's arms, studying his face with an expression so tender, it made Kevin's heart ache in the most beautiful way. You have me, he said firmly, completely, utterly, forever. You have all of me, Kevin Bennett, and I've never been happier to belong to someone in my entire life. Kevin felt tears gather in his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of Peter's words. I love you, he whispered, and the words carried the weight of everything he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. I love you too, Peter replied, cupping Kevin's face in his hands. And I want to build a beautiful life with you in this apartment, in this city, in whatever comes next. They signed the lease that afternoon, and as they walked home to Kevin's apartment to start planning their move, Kevin felt a contentment settle into his bones that he'd never experienced before. This was what happiness felt like, he realized. Not the fleeting high of temporary pleasure, but the deep, abiding satisfaction of being exactly where you belonged with exactly the right person. That evening, they called their families to share the news, and Kevin watched Peter's face light up as he talked to his parents about their new apartment, about Kevin, about the life they were building together. There had been difficult conversations in the weeks following their first kiss, moments of confusion and concern from people who loved Peter and wanted to understand this unexpected turn in his life. But Peter had navigated each conversation with grace and honesty, never wavering in his commitment to Kevin or to their relationship. Mom, you're going to love him, Peter was saying into the phone, his free hand finding Kevin's and squeezing gently. He's kind and smart and funny, and he makes me happier than I've ever been. I can't wait for you to meet him properly. Kevin's own family had been wonderfully supportive, welcoming Peter with open arms and treating him like the gift Kevin knew him to be. His mother had pulled Kevin aside after their first family dinner together and said, I've never seen you this happy, sweetheart. He's good for you. And Kevin had felt his heart swell with gratitude for parents who loved him enough to celebrate his joy, regardless of the form it took. As they fell asleep that night, wrapped in each other's arms in Kevin's bed, for what would be one of the last times before they moved to their new place, Kevin felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. For Peter's courage in following his heart, for his own patience in waiting for the right moment, for the mysterious alchemy that had transformed friendship into love. I love you, Peter murmured against Kevin's neck as sleep began to claim them both. I love you too, Kevin replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Peter's head. Sweet dreams. Moving day arrived with unseasonably warm weather and the kind of golden October light that made everything look like it was touched with magic. Kevin stood in the doorway of their apartment, watching Peter direct the movers with an efficiency that spoke of genuine excitement about this next chapter of their lives. Their friends had rallied to help with the move, and Kevin felt his heart swell as he watched Peter interact with the people who had become their chosen family. There was something beautiful about seeing the man he loved surrounded by people who cared about him, about witnessing the easy affection and genuine friendship that had developed over the past few months. Kevin, where do you want this box? Called Sarah Chen, one of Kevin's colleagues who had become a close friend to both of them. She was holding a box labeled Kevin's Books with a grin that suggested she knew exactly how heavy it was. Anywhere in the living room is fine, Kevin called back, then added with a laugh. Sorry about the wait. I may have a slight book addiction. Oh, slight, Peter said, appearing at Kevin's elbow with a box of his own. Kevin, you have books about books. You have books about how to organize books. You might need an intervention. Kevin bumped his shoulder against Peter's affectionately. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to move in with me. I did, Peter said, his voice soft with affection. And I wouldn't change a single book. By evening, the apartment was filled with boxes and the comfortable chaos of a life in transition. Their friends had left after helping them get the major furniture in place, and Kevin and Peter found themselves alone in their new home for the first time. Peter was standing in the kitchen, unpacking coffee mugs with the kind of focused concentration that Kevin had learned to associate with moments when Peter was processing something significant. Kevin approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt whatever internal conversation Peter was having with himself. "Penny, for your thought," Kevin said softly, and Peter looked up with a smile that was equal parts joy and wonder. "I was just thinking about how this feels like the first day of the rest of our lives," Peter said, setting down the mug he'd been holding and turning to face Kevin fully. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life was going to look like. And it was fine, you know? Comfortable and predictable and safe. But it wasn't this." Kevin moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in Peter's voice and the openness in his expression. "What is this?" he asked gently. Peter reached for Kevin's hands, linking their fingers together with a kind of deliberate tenderness that still made Kevin's heart skip. "This is magic," he said simply. "This is the kind of love that changes everything, that makes you understand why nothing else ever worked out. This is home, Kevin. You are home." Kevin felt tears gather in his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of Peter's words and the love shining in his eyes. "You're home for me too," he whispered. "You're everything I didn't know I was looking for, and everything I never dared to hope I could have." Peter kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Kevin felt his heart settle into a contentment that he knew would last a lifetime. They were home, finally and completely, in this apartment and in each other's arms and in the beautiful life they were building together one day at a time. As they stood in their new kitchen, surrounded by box and possibilities, in the warm glow of their shared future, Kevin thought about that morning months ago, when Peter had appeared at his desk with coffee and a smile that changed everything. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the courage it had taken for both of them to be honest about their feelings, the patience required to build something real and lasting. And he thought about tomorrow and the day after that, and all the mornings when Peter would wake up beside him in their bed, in their home, in the life they had chosen to build together. It was everything Kevin had ever wanted and more than he had ever dared to dream, and it was theirs, completely and forever. They spent the evening unpacking the essentials, working together with the kind of easy coordination that spoke of a deep understanding between them. Peter would start to reach for something, and Kevin would already be handing it to him. Kevin would begin to say something, and Peter would finish the thought. It was like they were two parts of the same whole, finally united after years of searching. "I can't believe we live here," Peter said as they finally collapsed onto their new couch, surrounded by half-empty boxes and the detritus of a life in transition. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream." Kevin pulled Peter closer, reveling in the solid warmth of him, in the reality of their shared space and shared future. "Not a dream," he said firmly. This is real. We're real." Peter smiled and settled more comfortably against Kevin's side. "The coffee was still warm in your hands that first morning when everything changed," he said softly. "Do you remember?" Kevin did remember. He remembered the exact moment when he'd realized that Peter was about to say something that would shift the entire trajectory of his life. He remembered the way his heart had raced, the way the world had seemed to hold its breath. "I remember," Kevin said, pressing a kiss to the top of Peter's head. "I remember thinking that my whole world was about to change." "It did change," Peter said, tilting his head up to look at Kevin. "We both changed. We became who we were meant to be." Kevin smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. The coffee was still warm in Kevin's hands when he realized his entire world had just shifted on its axis, and for the first time in his life, Kevin Bennett knew exactly where he belonged.